Nature never warns before it strikes. In moments of calm, bears have stormed camps, cabins, boats, and lodges with sudden fury. Families, hunters, and unsuspecting travelers found themselves trapped between instinct and terror, battling for survival against overwhelming force. From hunting close calls to midnight cabin intrusions, this video shares chilling true stories of bear encounters that prove how comfort can vanish when the wild breaks through. In early June 2025, deep in the Amur wilderness, a group of family friends gathered at a riverside campsite for a weekend of hiking and fishing. They pitched their tents near the tree line, unpacking supplies and cooking gear while the smell of food and scraps carried into the dense forest. Among the group was 27-year-old Anastasia Ivanova, who carefully set up her small shelter on the edge of the clearing. The air was quiet, with only the sound of crackling firewood and faint birdsong filling the space. Yet, danger lurked close, unseen among the trees. Without warning, the silence broke. A massive Russian grizzly surged from the dark brush, its bulk crashing through branches, drawn by the scent of stew and discarded garbage. The predator tore straight toward the nearest tent, its speed shocking in contrast to its size. In seconds, claws ripped into the fabric, shredding the flap and exposing Anastasia inside. Screams rang across the campsite as the animal seized her, dragging her violently into the clearing while the fabric of the tent split apart around her. The group erupted into panic. Some lunged forward with sticks and backpacks, slamming them against the ground in desperate attempts to scare the bear. Others shouted warnings, their voices cracking with fear, but the beast paid no attention. It swiped its massive paws, scattering gear in all directions, its grip never loosening on the woman it had torn from shelter. The sound of canvas ripping, mixed with terrified cries, transformed the peaceful campsite into chaos in seconds. Anastasia was tossed onto the ground, the predator's strength overwhelming. It shook her like prey, snarling and snapping, while horrified witnesses stood frozen in horror. A few tried to charge forward, but each rush ended with the animal wheeling around, eyes burning, forcing them to retreat. Pots, pans, and clothing flew through the air as campers hurled anything they could, but nothing stopped the relentless force towering above them. Every second dragged like an eternity. The predator's jaws closed, its weight pinning her body against the earth. The campers watched helplessly as the struggle ended swiftly, the violence too sudden to prevent. Some collapsed to their knees, hands clutching their heads, unable to process what their eyes had just seen. The clearing echoed with cries of grief, the fire still burning in the background, its scent now mixed with the smell of cooked food and blood. After long minutes that felt like hours, the massive figure finally backed away. Its muzzle was stained. Its chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. With one last glance toward the broken camp, the grizzly turned and faded into the dense forest, its dark body vanishing among the trees as quickly as it had appeared. The clearing lay in ruins. Tents were shredded, supplies scattered across mud and stone, and the fire smoldered low. Survivors stood motionless, paralyzed by shock, each of them knowing they had witnessed power and brutality they could neither fight nor forget. The ruined campsite lay in silence after the predator's retreat, but the damage was far from over. The fire burned low, its glow casting long shadows across the shredded canvas and broken poles. Survivors stood in shock, their faces pale in the dim light, unable to look at the place where their friend had been taken. The stillness of the forest pressed heavily on their chests, every faint rustle beyond the tree line a reminder that the threat could return at any moment. Some moved slowly, gathering pieces of gear that had been flung aside during the chaos. Clothing, cooking pots, and torn packs lay scattered across the mud, many soaked with blood or ripped beyond use. Others stood frozen, their legs too weak to carry them, their minds locked on the horrifying images they had just witnessed. The campsite, once meant for laughter and rest, now felt like a graveyard carved into the edge of the woods. As time passed, instinct drove them into action. A lantern was lit, its weak glow cutting through the darkness as they tried to collect what little remained intact. Food was thrown aside, knowing its scent had drawn danger to their clearing. Water bottles, blankets, and knives were gathered into small piles, yet none of them felt useful anymore. Every creak of the forest made them flinch, the memory of claws and teeth too fresh to ignore. The group eventually decided they could not stay. The ruined tents offered no protection, and the surrounding forest felt alive with menace. With shaking hands, they lifted what gear they could carry and began to move toward the riverbank. Their steps were uneven, the ground slippery with damp leaves, yet fear urged them forward. The lantern swung in the darkness, marking their path as they left the clearing behind, a place forever scarred by what had happened. Hours passed as they stumbled along the faint trail, exhaustion settling heavily on their shoulders. Each pause was filled with silence, broken only by the pounding of their hearts. The air grew colder, mist curling through the trees, but none dared to stop for long. Their grief followed them, pressing against every step, the weight of loss heavier than the packs on their backs. By dawn, the group reached the outskirts of a ranger station. Their bodies sagged with relief as they dropped their gear, but the pain did not ease. Officials were alerted, and the scene was later inspected with somber eyes. Tracks in the mud, torn tents, and clawed wood told the story clearly without words. News spread quickly beyond the forest, carried to nearby towns and villages. The story was shared with disbelief, yet the evidence could not be denied. For those who had survived, the memory of that night became a wound carved deep into their minds. They had entered the wild seeking peace, but instead had witnessed how fragile safety truly was. The Amur wilderness stood unchanged, but for the survivors, it would never again be the same. Late October 2024, in the forests of Vermont, a heavy stillness fell as night settled around a small wooden cabin. Inside, Emily Parker and her partner, Josh Miller, had ended their day with quiet comfort, their German shepherd, Max, stretched across the floorboards near the door. Outside, the wilderness pressed close, the trees heavy with autumn leaves, the air cold and sharp. But beyond the calm, another presence stirred in the dark, drawn by a smell no walls could fully hide. From the edge of the clearing, a large black bear moved slowly toward the cabin. The scent of stored food and trash clung to the night air, guiding the animal across the forest floor. Its paws pressed silently against fallen leaves until it reached the porch. The wooden steps creaked faintly under its weight, a warning too late to stop what was about to unfold. Max, sensing the intruder, sprang up with a bark that shook the silence. His body lunged forward with fearless force, teeth bared and throat rumbling as he charged at the looming figure. But the predator met him with brutal speed. One massive paw struck, claws sinking deep. The bear seized Max in its jaws, shaking him violently until the sound of snapping bone broke through the night. The fight ended in seconds, the dog's form limp against the ground, his life taken before his owners could even react. Through the cabin's window, Emily and Josh froze in horror, their screams trapped behind glass. The bear turned its bloodied head toward the glow of the lantern light, eyes catching the movement inside. With a roar, it stormed the cabin, smashing its weight against the door. The wood cracked, each strike splintering boards and loosening hinges, the walls shuddering with every blow. Josh grabbed the nearest object, a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. He banged against the furniture, the noise echoing through the small room as he tried to create confusion. However, the sound did little to slow the relentless assault. The door groaned, wood tearing at the seams as claws raked across its surface. Emily acted with frantic clarity, her hands trembling as she loaded a flare into its small launcher. Aimed through the open window, the flare screamed into the dark, bursting with red fire that lit the trees in a violent glow. The sudden light startled the bear. It paused, swinging its head as sparks rained across the clearing. Another strike rattled the door, but hesitation grew in the predator's movements. At last, with a final growl, the animal turned away, retreating into the blackness of the forest. Its heavy steps faded into the distance, leaving only silence broken by the sound of their racing breaths. The cabin was left scarred. Boards hung shattered from the frame. Gear was scattered across the floor, and blood smeared the porch where Max had fallen. Emily and Josh stood frozen, uninjured but broken by what they had seen. In that single night, the wilderness had shown its unforgiving power. The silence that followed the retreat of the black bear pressed heavily on the ruined cabin. Emily and Josh stood motionless, their breathing sharp and shallow, the air thick with the scent of smoke and blood. The shattered doorway gaped wide to the night, its frame bent and splintered, leaving them exposed to the forest beyond. On the porch, the lifeless body of Max lay still, his form marked by claw and tooth, the loyal guardian silenced in moments. Grief and shock anchored them in place, the weight of loss falling harder than the fear itself. Inside, the damage painted a clear picture of the fight for survival. Furniture lay overturned, broken pieces scattered across the floor. The flashlight and bat lay discarded near the hearth, reminders of how little power they had carried against the force of the attack. The flare launcher rested empty on the table, its barrel warm from desperate use. Every surface bore scratches, dents, or stains, proof that the cabin had ceased to be a haven. Josh forced himself to step outside, his boots crunching against the broken boards, eyes fixed on the ground where Max had fallen. He crouched, his hands trembling as he touched the dog's fur, now cold in the night air. Emily followed, her face pale, shoulders shaking as she knelt beside him. Together, they lifted their companion and carried him gently into the cabin. Lying him near the fire, they wrapped him in a blanket, unable to speak, their silence carrying a grief deeper than words could ever hold. Hours passed with no rest. Each creak of timber or rustle of leaves outside made them start, their minds replaying the sight of claws tearing wood and jaws snapping shut. The fire flickered weakly, its glow casting long shadows that reminded them of the predator's presence. Sleep never came, their bodies locked in tension, their hearts beating fast at every sound. They knew the bear could return, and with the doorway destroyed, nothing truly stood between them and the wild. By morning, the forest seemed calm again. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the broken porch, but its beauty only sharpened the memory of the night before. Together, they dug a shallow grave beside the cabin, their hands blistering as they worked the hard soil. They laid Max to rest with quiet care, the German shepherd's service ending not with ceremony, but with tears and heavy silence. The earth closed over him, but the memory of his bravery burned deep in their hearts. In the days that followed, they gathered what little remained of their supplies and left the cabin behind. The broken door and torn walls stood as warnings to others who might seek comfort in the wilderness without caution. For Emily and Josh, the lesson was written in fear and sorrow. Even in places built for shelter, nature could break through without mercy. The memory of that night would never fade, etched into their lives as the cost of forgetting how close the wild always was. Late July 2025, on the remote edge of Kodiak Island, the gray morning sky hung low above the cove as two brothers prepared their catch. Mark Thompson, 34, and his younger brother Luke, 31, worked from their small boat, knives flashing as they cleaned salmon freshly pulled from the icy water. Scales glistened on the boards, fish carcasses piled at their feet, the salty air heavy with the smell of blood and flesh. The tide lapped softly against the hull, a calm rhythm masking the danger lurking just beyond the tree line. From the dense green wall of alder and spruce, movement stirred. Without sound or warning, A colossal Kodiak bear pushed through the thicket, its vast shoulders heaving as it emerged into the open shore. The predator's nose twitched, catching the scent of fish, its dark eyes locking on the brothers bent over their work. In an instant, the quiet of the cove shattered. The massive bear lunged forward with terrifying speed, the ground quaking beneath each stride. Mark barely had time to look up before the animal closed the distance. With a swipe of its paw, claws hooked into his chest, knocking him clean off the boat and into the freezing waves. The cold bit into him like knives as he thrashed in the water. But worse than the chill was the looming shadow of the beast leaning over, claws slicing at him with each surge. His jacket tore open, blood seeping into the sea as he fought to keep his head above the crashing tide. On the boat, Luke reacted in blind panic. He snatched up an oar, the only weapon within reach, and swung as the bear reared onto the side of the craft. The blow landed hard, but the predator hardly flinched. Its paw lashed out with brutal force, tearing through his forearm and hurling him backward onto the gravel of the shoreline. Pain seared through him, his grip weakening as blood ran down to his fingertips. The bear pressed its assault, its jaws snapping inches from Luke's chest. He scrambled on the stones, clutching at whatever he could throw. Salmon carcasses flew through the air, splattering across the mud, their scent stronger than fear. Shouting, staggering, and bleeding, he hurled the remains one after another, desperate to shift the predator's focus. The distraction worked. The animal's attention wavered, its head turning toward the heap of flesh scattered across the shore. With a final roar, it spun and lumbered back toward the cover of trees, vanishing as swiftly as it had come. The forest swallowed the sound, leaving only silence and the rush of the tide. Mark clung to the boat's gunwale, dragging himself from the water, his face pale, his chest slashed with deep wounds. Luke staggered to his side, one arm slick with blood, their catch scattered and their gear broken. The cove, moments before a place of work, had become a scene of violence and fear, marked by loss and survival balanced on a razor's edge. Mark collapsed onto the rocky shore, his clothes torn and soaked, every breath sharp with pain. Blood seeped across his chest where the claws had torn deep, the salt water stinging each open wound. Luke knelt beside him, his own arm dripping red, teeth clenched against the burn. The cove was quiet now, but the silence felt heavy, weighed down by the weight of what had just unfolded. Their gear lay scattered in the mud, fish ruined, nets tangled, oars splintered. What had begun as a simple fishing trip was now a fight to keep one another alive. The forest loomed dark beyond the beach, and though the animal had retreated, the fear of its return pressed on them with every passing second. The boat rocked gently, half submerged from the impact, its hull scratched where claws had raked across the boards. Both men knew there was no safety in the vessel now. Every sound from the tree line, a shifting branch, a crow calling overhead, made them tense, bracing for the massive shape to reappear. Mark tried to stand, his legs weak from the cold and blood loss, but his strength failed. Luke steadied him with his uninjured arm, though his own body shook from exhaustion. They moved together slowly, staggering along the beach toward higher ground. Each step left dark stains across the sand, a visible trail marking their path. The waves behind them washed over the boat and the ruined catch, carrying pieces of salmon into the tide, as if erasing what little they had come for. When they reached a cluster of driftwood near the tree line, they paused, collapsing against the logs. The pain in their bodies grew sharper with the stillness, every cut and bruise screaming now that the rush of adrenaline had faded. Mark pressed a strip of cloth against his chest, the fabric darkening instantly, while Luke bound his own arm with the remains of his torn sleeve. The crude dressing slowed the bleeding, but could not erase the damage. Time moved slowly, the weight of survival sinking in heavier than the wounds. As dusk spread across the island, the world dimmed, shadows stretching across the cove. The brothers sat close, the crackle of their shallow breaths the only sound. The bear had gone, but its presence lingered in claw marks carved into the sand, in the scattered remains of their supplies, in the fear that it might return under cover of night. They whispered no plans, for words could not undo what had happened. Survival now meant waiting, enduring, and trusting that dawn might bring safety. By morning, light revealed the true scale of ruin. The boat sat tilted on its side, half filled with water, useless for travel. Salmon remained littered on the shore, torn by waves and claws. Blood stained the tide line where Mark had pulled himself free. The land itself bore the memory of violence, a story written in marks no storm could wash away. For both men, the lesson was clear. In Kodiak territory, even skill and strength could be swept aside in seconds, leaving only the will to endure. Late November 2024 in Bavaria, Germany, the wildlife park grew quiet as dusk settled. But inside the brown bear enclosure, tension was building. Marcus Weber, 42, moved with practiced steps through his evening routine, carrying food buckets toward the barrier. The animal inside, a massive adult male named Bruno, had shown restless signs in recent weeks, pacing along the fence line, growling at unseen threats and swiping the ground with his paws. Marcus had fed him countless times before, but that evening the mood felt heavier, the bear's movements sharper, its presence carrying a weight that pressed against the steel bars. As Marcus placed feed near the gate, the silence broke. Bruno lunged with terrifying force, his enormous frame smashing against the metal partition. The weak section of the enclosure, long overlooked, buckled instantly. In a single violent burst, the bear tore through, iron screeching as bolts ripped free. Marcus stumbled back, but there was no time to escape. The animal's massive paw connected, claws tearing across his arm, slicing through cloth and skin. Blood sprayed across the dirt as he fell, his chest struck a second time by another swipe that raked deep into muscle. The attack unfolded in chaos. Bruno pressed forward, his weight shaking the ground, teeth bared, breath steaming in the cold night air. Marcus tried to crawl, but the predator's reach was relentless. He raised his arms in defense, only for claws to dig deeper, shredding through fabric and leaving long wounds across his torso. Each strike drove him closer to collapse, his body already weakening under the sheer force of blows that would have shattered lesser bones. Nearby staff heard the screams and rushed toward the enclosure. Their shouts echoed as they fired flare guns into the air, the flashes casting sharp light across the pen. Others banged hard on metal gates, the sound clashing through the park like thunder. For tense minutes, the scene balanced on disaster. Bruno towering over his keeper, driven by instinct and rage. The animal reared, roaring, distracted only by the piercing crack of more flares and the clanging of iron bars. The moment of pause gave Marcus the chance to crawl toward a reinforced barrier. Blood trailed behind him as he dragged his body, vision blurred and breath ragged. Every inch felt endless, but the sounds of staff keeping the animal at bay bought him the seconds he needed. With a final desperate push, he reached the heavier gate, slamming himself behind it just as Bruno lunged again, claws screeching against steel that finally held. The bear snarled, pacing in fury, but the chance to attack was gone. Marcus collapsed behind the barrier, his uniform torn, his body soaked in blood. The team rushed in, pulling him clear and applying pressure to his wounds. Emergency medical units arrived soon after, treating deep cuts and heavy bruising while others secured the bear inside a separate holding area. The air smelled of smoke from flares, mixed with iron and dust, a reminder of how close death had come. The attack left no doubt. Even inside a park designed for control, the power of a brown bear could tear through steel and flesh in seconds. Survival had hinged not on routine, but on raw luck and the frantic response of those who ran toward danger. Late November 2024 in Bavaria's wildlife park had ended with Marcus Weber barely alive behind the reinforced barrier, but the ordeal was only beginning. Emergency teams rushed him through the service roads, their hands pressing down on wounds that bled heavily with each jolt of the vehicle. His uniform, once neat for the evening routine, was shredded and darkened, soaked through with blood and dirt. The claws had cut deeply, leaving muscle exposed and ribs bruised from the force of impact. By the time he reached the ambulance, his body was trembling with shock, his breath shallow, his skin pale. The park fell silent behind him, but the image of Bruno slamming through the broken gate lingered over everyone who had witnessed the chaos. At the hospital, surgeons worked for hours to close the wounds. Long cuts across his torso needed layers of stitching, while his arm, shredded from shoulder to wrist, required careful reconstruction. His survival depended as much on quick medical care as it did on the staff who had drawn the bear's attention with flares and noise. When Marcus finally regained strength days later, his body carried scars that would last for life, reminders of how close the encounter had come to ending in tragedy. The keepers who had known him for years visited quietly, each struck by how a routine task had turned into a near-fatal accident. Meanwhile, the park itself became the center of attention. Officials inspected the enclosure, finding twisted bars and bolts wrenched from their sockets where Bruno had forced his way through. Questions immediately arose about the safety standards of the gates, the oversight of maintenance, and the risks posed to both staff and visitors. The incident was widely reported, with headlines highlighting negligence and a failure to take necessary precautions. Families who frequently visited the park expressed concern, while wildlife experts debated the unpredictable nature of large carnivores, even when they are in captivity. The weight of public scrutiny grew heavy, pressing the park management to respond with urgency. Bruno was sedated and moved to a secondary enclosure designed with reinforced steel barriers, double gates, and higher fencing. The bear's restless behavior was studied, some experts linking it to stress, lack of stimulation, or breeding season instincts. For many, however, the conclusion was simpler. A wild animal remained dangerous, regardless of years spent in captivity. The incident became a harsh reminder that no amount of familiarity could erase instinct, and that one lapse in infrastructure could turn routine care into a catastrophe. For Marcus, recovery extended far beyond the hospital walls. Physical therapy began slowly, with each movement painful and each stretch a test of will. His arm carried limited strength, and his torso burned with every attempt to lift a weight. The zookeeper, who had once handled animals with practiced ease, now faced the challenge of learning basic motions again. Yet the emotional toll cut deeper than the wounds. Sleep was broken by sudden jolts, visions of claws slashing, roars echoing, and the sight of Bruno lunging through the broken barrier. Colleagues and family rallied around him, but the question of return lingered. Could he step back into the same park, facing the same animal that had nearly killed him? Time would tell, yet one truth was clear. The scars on his body were matched by scars on the institution itself. The attack forced a reckoning, prompting the zoo to rebuild trust, reinforce every gate, and acknowledge that even within its walls, the power of a brown bear could never be fully contained. Late December 2024 in Alaska's Chugach Mountains brought a night that guests at a remote ski lodge would never forget. The slopes outside were quiet beneath a rising moon, while inside, laughter mingled with the scent of cocoa and the sound of boots stomping against the wood floors. Families and skiers gathered near the wide entrance, adjusting bindings and chatting about the day on the trails. The warmth of the room and the glow of firelight gave a sense of safety, but in the dark timber beyond, danger was already moving closer. From the tree line came the hulking shape of a massive grizzly, its bulk shifting through snow and shadow. Drawn by the rich scent of trash and food stored behind the building, it broke from the forest edge with shocking speed. Before anyone realized what was happening, the animal crashed through a side entry, its weight splintering the frame as skis and benches toppled under the impact. Screams filled the lodge as guests scattered, some diving behind counters, others pressed flat against the walls as the beast barreled forward. The sudden intrusion sent a wave of panic through the room. Plates clattered to the ground, Mugs shattered, and decorations fell from shelves as the animal surged deeper into the lodge. The great body swung its head side to side, nostrils flaring, claws scraping across wooden floors. In one swipe, it struck a heavy table, dishes exploding into fragments across the fire-lit room. Men and women leapt out of reach, some stumbling and bruising themselves in the rush. The air carried the scent of fear, sweat, and broken wood as chaos overtook the once cozy evening. At the center of the turmoil, Eric Sorensen, the manager, and ski instructor Lena Kova acted quickly. Grabbing whatever they could find, they hammered pans together and stomped, trying to draw the bear's attention away from the trapped visitors. The noise echoed off the lodge walls, but the animal only roared louder, pawing through fallen chairs and sending splinters spinning across the floor. Its massive shadow moved across the walls like a storm cloud, leaving nothing untouched in its path. Guests scrambled across the lounge, some crawling under overturned benches, others clutching their coats and packs as makeshift shields. A few were cut and scraped in the rush, blood streaking arms and faces where they had fallen against sharp wood or broken glass. Each second stretched long, the sound of claws against the floorboards drowning the shouts of those trying to stay calm. The bear's strength showed with every motion. It smashed into another table, sending candles and cups scattering into the fire pit at the center of the hall. Flames flared high, shadows stretched across the ceiling, and the growl of the predator drowned every other sound. Only when Eric fired a bright flare through the broken doorway did the animal recoil. Startled by the burst of light and heat, it backed toward the open door, roaring once more before storming back into the forest. The silence that followed pressed heavily across the wreckage. The lodge was torn and battered, its walls scarred, its furniture shattered, and its guests shaken and clinging to each other. Relief came slowly, but the knowledge burned sharp. Even in a place built for comfort, the wild could break through without warning. The lodge fell into a tense silence after the bear's roar had faded into the forest. Guests who had hidden behind broken counters and overturned furniture began to move slowly, their faces pale and their hands shaking. Plates and mugs lay shattered across the floor, cocoa staining the boards, and scraps of wood from the splintered door crunched underfoot. The smell of smoke from the stove mixed with the sharp scent of fear that lingered in the room. No one spoke at first, the weight of shock pressing down heavier than the damage scattered around them. Several of the injured sat slumped against walls, clutching their arms and legs where claws and splinters had left scratches and bruises. The ski instructor guided them carefully toward a corner, laying coats over their shoulders to keep them warm in the chill. The manager checked the stove to make sure no fire spread from the broken pots and bent metal. With every step they took, the walls groaned, bearing marks where the animal had forced its way inside. The lodge that once felt safe now seemed fragile, its walls scarred by raw power. Outside, lanterns were raised as a few staff searched the snowy ground for tracks. The prints left in the soft drifts were enormous, deep, and sharp-edged, each one pressed firmly as the animal stormed away. They stretched far toward the dark tree line, fading where shadows swallowed the trail. The staff returned quickly, their voices low, fearful that the bear might circle back. The threat of its return hung heavy, each gust of wind rattling the broken frame of the side door, reminding them that the danger was never far away. Through the night, no one slept. Guests sat huddled near the hearth, listening to the forest groan outside as snow fell against the windows. Every crackle of wood in the fire made some flinch. Every rustle of branches outside pulled their eyes to the broken doorway. The manager stayed near the entrance with a flare in hand, the ski instructor close by with a lantern. Together they kept watch, their faces tight with exhaustion but unwilling to relax until daylight came. When morning arrived, the light revealed the scale of destruction more clearly. The dining tables were shattered, skis lay bent and splintered, and the walls bore deep claw marks that scarred the beams. The floor was covered in debris, mixed with food and broken glass, each piece telling the story of chaos that had swept through only hours before. Guests walked carefully around the wreckage, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes still wide with disbelief. By midday, word of the attack had spread to nearby communities. Rangers arrived, studying the scene with grim expressions, noting the trail of the bear and the weaknesses of the lodge that had allowed it inside. They reminded the staff that stored food and waste had likely drawn the predator close, a mistake that turned the quiet retreat into a place of terror. The guests, though alive, carried scars of the night in their memories more than on their flesh. They packed quickly, leaving behind broken gear and ruined supplies, eager to escape the place that no longer felt like shelter. For them, the ski lodge would never again be just a resort in the mountains. It was now a reminder of how quickly the wild could break through walls and turn comfort into chaos. In September 2024, the remote wilds of Sakhalin were shrouded in a thin fog that clung to the banks of a slow-moving river. The quiet air was filled with the crunch of boots and the weight of fine rifles carried by hunters who had traveled far for a luxury expedition. Oleg Morozov, 45, studied the ground where fresh deer tracks pressed into the damp soil, while Ivan Petrov and Sergei Kuznetsov kept close by with their guides. The forest seemed calm, the kind of calm that hides what waits beyond sight. The men whispered among themselves, admiring the land, unaware that danger had already fixed its eyes on them from deeper shadows. While the others lingered, Oleg's attention drifted toward a dense thicket where strange sounds broke through the mist. He stepped slowly away from the group, brushing aside branches, the soft ground carrying him closer to the unknown. What he did not see was the enormous Russian grizzly crouched just beyond, its muscles tight with anger, its cubs hidden close by. The bear had already sensed the intrusion, and when the figure moved within reach, the fragile line between watchfulness and fury snapped instantly. The forest erupted as the predator exploded forward, breaking through the brush with a roar that shook the air. In a single surge, the animal closed the gap, its massive weight scattering soil and leaves in every direction. Oleg raised his rifle, the barrel trembling as he tried to steady himself, but the shot went wide. The crack of gunfire echoed uselessly across the river, leaving him defenseless as the beast struck. The impact crushed him to the ground, claws tearing across his chest and neck with violent force. His body twisted under the assault, blood spilling across the moss in dark streams. Ivan and Sergei spun at the sound, horror flashing as they saw their friend pinned under a storm of muscle and fury. The bear raked again, shredding cloth and flesh while the man beneath could only scream against the weight pressing down. Driven by desperate instinct, the others lunged toward the chaos, swinging their rifles like clubs, shouting with all the air in their lungs. They hurled stones and struck the ground with anything they could find, each noise meant to distract the predator. For a moment, the bear lifted its massive head, foam dripping from its jaws, eyes blazing with rage. Still, it pressed again, unwilling to leave until it had made its warning clear. The struggle stretched on through endless seconds, the men forcing themselves between safety and death. Each strike of wood against stone and each thrown rock chipped away at the beast's fury. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the grizzly gave ground. With a growl that rattled the air, it stepped back toward the thicket, its heavy frame fading into the brush as quickly as it had come. The clearing was left in ruin. Oleg lay torn and unmoving, his chest rising only in shallow bursts, while his companions staggered, breathless, their clothes torn and hands raw. The riverbank, once calm, had become a scene painted with blood, broken branches, and the reminder that no hunt, no matter how carefully planned, was ever free from the dangers that live unseen in the wilderness. The moments after the grizzly faded into the thicket were heavy with silence, broken only by labored breaths. Ivan and Sergei dropped to their knees beside Oleg, their hands shaking as they tried to stop the bleeding with scraps of cloth. His skin was pale, eyes unfocused, chest rising faintly with each shallow gasp. The moss beneath him turned dark, and the sharp smell of iron lingered in the air. The men shouted for their guides, their voices carrying over the foggy river, hoping for help that was far away. Every attempt to move him brought new groans of pain, and the broken ground made even the smallest step impossible without risk. They laid him flat, pressing hard against the torn flesh, but blood slipped through their fingers faster than they could hold it back. The shock of what had just happened left them dazed, hearts pounding, as they watched the life drain from their friend, while the wilderness stood indifferent all around them. Minutes felt like hours before the guides appeared, their faces frozen with disbelief at the scene. They signaled desperately for emergency aid, but deep in the Sakhalin forest, distance was its own enemy. Time passed with only the sounds of wind in the trees and Oleg's breathing growing fainter until finally it stopped altogether. Ivan and Sergei sat stunned, unable to speak, their rifles useless at their sides. When rescue teams at last arrived, they found the men broken in spirit, their companion gone. The trip that had promised success and comfort ended in grief, the ruined clearing marked forever by claw scars and blood. The lesson was clear. Even the finest planning could not shield them from the hidden dangers waiting in the wild.